Senior Analyst ZX427's crystalline appendages trembled as they clutched the data crystal, their normally iridescent surface clouded with stress patterns. The evaluation center's corridors, usually a place of quiet contemplation and methodical analysis, echoed with the unusual sound of their rapid movement. In 300 years of service to the Galactic Council's Department of Emerging Species, they had never broken protocol to demand an emergency session. Until today. The massive doors of the council chamber parted, revealing the tiered seats where representatives of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations gathered. High Counselor Vex Prime's sensor arrays focused on the agitated analyst with barely concealed annoyance. Analyst ZX427. The High Counselor's harmonics resonated through the chamber. Explain this breach of protocol. ZX427 interfaced with the central projection system, their crystalline form refracting light in patterns that conveyed deep disturbance. Honored Council, my latest evaluation of species 47,291b, designation humans, has revealed anomalies that threaten the very foundation of our predictive models. The chamber filled with dismissive harmonic tones. Another primitive organic species, questioned Representative Myrex, their energy form flickering with amusement. Their technological level barely registers on the advancement scale. That's precisely the problem. ZX427 projected the first data set. Dr. Amanda Mitchell, a human quantum physicist from a region designated Montana, was attempting to repair a primitive food preparation device called a microwave. In the process, she accidentally discovered a method of faster-than-light communication that our scientists had deemed theoretically impossible. The chamber fell silent. A fluke, someone suggested. I considered that possibility. ZX427 continued, projecting more data, until I examined the pattern. James Cooper, a maintenance worker at a facility called Mall of America, solved a complex gravitational equation while trying to fix an elevator. Simply because, in his words, the numbers looked wrong. A high school student named Rachel Martinez developed a revolutionary approach to bioengineering while working on what they call a science fair project. The analyst's crystalline form pulsed with urgency. These humans don't follow any known progression patterns. They make technological leaps not through careful advancement, but through what they call hunches and lucky guesses. They solve complex problems by accident while attempting to do completely unrelated tasks. High Counselor Vex Prime's sensor arrays narrowed. Surely their success rate must be negligible. That's the most disturbing part. ZX427 projected a new series of statistics. They fail constantly. Their history is filled with millions of failures. But instead of following the logical course and abandoning failed approaches, they persist. They adapt. The analyst's translation matrix struggled. They try crazy ideas just to see what happens. The chamber erupted in disbelief. Representative Myrex's energy form crackled. That's not possible. No species can advance without following the logical progression of technological development. Humans don't just ignore logical progression. They leapfrog it entirely. ZX427 displayed their most disturbing finding. They went from primitive atmospheric flight to landing on their moon in just 66 years. Not because they were ready, not because it was the logical next step, but because one of their leaders said, and I quote, "We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard." The council chamber filled with the equivalent of horrified gasps. The concept of choosing a harder path over an easier one violated every principle of efficient advancement. There's more, ZX427 continued. They routinely survive scenarios our models indicate should be impossible. A human cargo pilot named Mike Henderson survived in space for 3 days using nothing but adhesive strips they called duct tape to patch a hull breach. When asked how he calculated the precise tensile strength needed, he said he eyeballed it. High Counselor Vex Prime's voice carried an edge of concern. "What are you suggesting, analyst?" Honored Council, humans don't just defy our predictions. They defy prediction itself. They advance through chaos, succeed through failure, and treat the impossible as merely inconvenient. Our models can't predict them because they don't follow patterns. They break them. The analyst's final words echoed through the silent chamber. And they're about to achieve faster than light travel, not through centuries of careful research, but because a graduate student named Kevin Murphy made a mistake in his calculations and decided to test it anyway. The galaxy isn't ready for a species that treats the laws of physics as mere suggestions. The council chamber erupted into chaos, as unthinkable as that concept had been just moments before. Humanity's age of isolation was about to end, and the galaxy would never be the same. Captain Jack Reynolds slouched in his chair at the high-stakes table aboard the Thoraxian trade station, his weathered leather jacket standing out against the sleek biosuits of his alien opponents. The massive casino's crystalline dome offered a spectacular view of 3 different spiral arms of the galaxy, but Jack's eyes remained fixed on the cards in front of him. Across the table, First Trader Xylos 9 of the Mercantile Federation clicked its mandibles in what passed for smugness among its species. The alien's probability computer, illegally integrated into its neural network, calculated a 99.97% chance of victory based on the known cards and possible combinations. I shall increase the stake by 50 million credits, Xylos 9 announced, its translator rendering the clicks and whistles into standard Galactic. The alien's compound eyes studied Jack's face, for the microscopic tells its species was famous for detecting. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd of spectators. 50 million credits could buy a small moon in the outer sectors. Jack's only visible reaction was to take another sip of what he'd been calling whiskey, though the station's synthesizers hadn't quite gotten the recipe right. "Call," Jack said casually, "and I'll raise you the mining rights to the Epsilon cluster." The crowd's murmur turned to shocked whispers. The Epsilon cluster's resource-rich asteroids were worth more than most planetary systems. The human had just bet the equivalent of a year's GDP for a mid-sized stellar nation on what the aliens' probability computers insisted was a losing hand. 2 seats down, a quantum collective representative's crystalline form clouded with confusion. Their species, which experienced all quantum possibilities simultaneously, had never understood the appeal of games of chance. There was, after all, nothing random in a properly calculated universe. Xylos 9's mandibles clicked rapidly as it consulted its probability computer again. The numbers hadn't changed. Your species' tendency toward illogical risk-taking is well documented, Captain Reynolds. The mathematics of this situation are absolute. Jack grinned, an expression that his alien opponent still hadn't learned to properly interpret. "You know what we humans say about math." He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Sometimes 2 + 2 = 5, if you know how to sell it right." The human pushed his entire stack of credits into the pot. The watching crowd grew larger as news of the astronomical stakes spread through the station. Representatives from major trading houses huddled with their probability computers, running scenarios and whispering in dozens of languages. Xylos 9's compound eyes narrowed. "Your attempt at psychological manipulation is transparent. My probability computer indicates." "You know what else we humans say?" Jack interrupted, his grin widening. "A computer is only as good as its programming. And your programming doesn't account for something we call bluffing." The alien's mandibles ceased their constant motion. "This, bluffing. It is the practice of intentional deception for tactical advantage." Close enough. But that would invalidate all mathematical models of probable outcomes. Jack spread his cards on the table. "Welcome to poker, friend." The crowd erupted. Probability computers across the station crashed as they attempted to reconcile the impossible outcome. Xylos 9's compound eyes darted between Jack's cards and its own, its mandibles working soundlessly as it tried to understand how its perfect calculations had failed. In the aftermath, as Jack collected his winnings and the story spread across subspace channels, the Galactic Council received an urgent report. Humanity had introduced an element of chaos into the carefully ordered economic systems of the galaxy. Markets fluctuated wildly as trading houses tried to account for the possibility of bluffing in their predictions. Later that evening, Jack sat in his ship's cockpit, sending a message back to Earth. "Mission accomplished," he typed. "They still haven't figured out that poker isn't even our most unpredictable game. Wait until they discovered day trading." The Council's worst fears were being realized. Humans weren't just defying probability in their discoveries and innovations. They were weaponizing unpredictability itself. And somewhere in the galaxy, a former Vegas card shark was teaching aliens that sometimes the best strategy was no strategy at all. In the decades to come, gambling would be remembered as just the beginning. The galaxy was about to learn that when it came to humans, the only predictable thing was their unpredictability. Michael O'Connor straightened his tie as he strode into the Grand Hall of Galactic Jurisprudence, his well-worn briefcase looking distinctly out of place among the hovering data crystals and quantum archives. The Brooklyn-born attorney had spent 3 months studying the Galactic legal code, and he'd found something that made him smile. Nowhere did it explicitly state that laws had to make sense. The towering crystalline form of Chief Adjudicator Vex Maximus loomed over the proceedings. The Council moves to restrict human expansion into the Carina sector under Statute 7249B, citing potential disruption to established trade routes. "Objection, Your Luminance," O'Connor called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "I'd like to direct the court's attention to the definition of trade routes as established in the Third Galactic Convention." The assembled alien legal experts shifted uncomfortably. They had calculated a 99.9% probability of this being a routine restriction hearing. The human wasn't following the standard procedure of immediate compliance. The statute clearly states, began one of the Council's legal representatives, a floating collective of intelligent gas, that trade routes are defined as established paths through space used primarily for commercial transport. O'Connor interrupted, pulling a dog-eared copy of the legal code from his briefcase. But if we look at subsection 47, paragraph 9, the word primarily is used. This implies that these routes serve other purposes, which opens up consideration under the multiple-use doctrine of 2847. The Chief Adjudicator's crystalline surface clouded with confusion. The multiple-use doctrine has never been applied to spatial navigation rights. But it's never been explicitly excluded either. O'Connor grinned, warming to his subject. In fact, I'd argue that by not specifically excluding it, the framers of the law intended it to be applicable in exactly this type of situation. A ripple of disbelief passed through the chamber. The concept of arguing based on what a law didn't say was completely alien to the gathered legal minds. Furthermore, O'Connor continued, pulling out another well-thumbed volume. The very ancient and completely unbreakable trade agreement of the Fifth Epoch, which you were citing as precedent, was signed 20,000 years ago. Humanity didn't exist then, so we couldn't have been party to it. Therefore, under the principle of universal consent. But that's not how the principle of universal consent works, protested a multidimensional being of pure legal knowledge. Says who? O'Connor countered. Show me where it says we can't interpret it that way. And while you're at it, explain why the temporal exclusion clause shouldn't apply to species that didn't exist when a law was written. The chamber erupted into chaos as legal experts frantically searched their databases. O'Connor kept pushing, introducing concepts like reasonable doubt, spirit of the law versus letter of the law, and most disturbingly, legal precedent can evolve. By the time he finished his argument, citing everything from ancient Earth maritime law to a particularly relevant episode of Law and Order, the galactic legal system had developed its first headache. The Chief Adjudicator's final ruling sent shockwaves through the galaxy. While this body cannot fully comprehend the logical framework of the human argument, we also cannot find any explicit prohibition against it. Motion denied. Later, in the station's recreational sector, O'Connor sat sharing a drink with a young hive-mind legal clerk who had watched the proceedings. But how can you argue a position without absolute certainty of its correctness? The clerk's 1,000 voices asked in unison. O'Connor chuckled. Kid, half of being a lawyer is convincing everyone else you're right. The other half is figuring out what the law could mean, not just what everyone thinks it means. Sometimes, the craziest argument works just because nobody ever thought to say it couldn't. As news of the ruling spread, law schools across the galaxy faced an unprecedented crisis. Students began asking what-if questions. The Council's attempt to contain humanity through regulations had backfired spectacularly. They had learned a harsh lesson. Never try to constrain with rules a species that sees them as intellectual puzzles to be solved. And somewhere in a Brooklyn law office, a sign appeared in the window. Now offering services in galactic law. No case too weird, no regulation too ancient to challenge. Captain Jessica Wade stared through the U.S. Providence's viewport at the approaching Vorax battle fleet, absently tapping her lucky wrench against her thigh. The massive warships, their crystalline hulls gleaming with weaponry, had appeared out of nowhere during a routine asteroid mining operation. "They're hailing us," Lieutenant Sarah Cooper announced from her jury-rigged communications station. Really just a repurposed mining scanner with some creative modifications. The Vorax commander's insectoid face filled their main screen. "Primitive vessel, you have entered restricted space. Your ship's specifications indicate no meaningful defensive capabilities. Surrender immediately." Wade glanced around her bridge, if you could call it that. The Providence was a converted cargo hauler with mining equipment bolted on wherever it would fit. Her crew of 12 had more experience fixing broken drill bits than handling combat situations. But they were humans, and if there was one thing humans knew how to do. "Lieutenant Cooper, remind me what we learned in that engineering safety seminar last month," Wade asked, a familiar glint in her eye. Cooper grinned, catching on immediately. "That our plasma mining laser operates at nearly the same frequency as Vorax shield generators." "Engineering." Wade keyed the comm. "How fast can you retune our mining laser?" Chief Engineer Mike Rodriguez's voice crackled back. "Give me 5 minutes and some duct tape. Also, that coffee maker you keep complaining about. I've got an idea." The Vorax commander's mandibles clicked in irritation. "Your delay tactics are futile. You have 60 seconds to power down your systems." Wade leaned forward, her voice carrying the calm confidence that had gotten her through 3 Mars colony disasters. "Actually, we were just calculating the resonance frequencies of crystalline hull structures. Fascinating stuff. Did you know that certain mining vibrations can create harmonic patterns in crystal?" The commander's compound eyes narrowed. "What are you?" The Providence shuddered as Rodriguez worked his magic. The mining laser, now modified with parts from their backup life support system and calibrated using what Rodriguez called eyeballing it, fired a precise beam at the Vorax flagship. The energy didn't hit their shields. It passed right through them, matching their frequency perfectly. "Impossible," the commander's translator squawked. "Your technology level cannot." "That's the thing about humans," Wade interrupted, watching as the beam set up a resonance pattern in the crystalline hull. "We don't much care about cannot. Cooper, how's that coffee maker bomb coming?" "Ready to launch, Captain." Rodriguez turned it into some kind of localized EMP device, something about the caffeine molecular structure being similar to their neural network patterns. The Providence's makeshift weapons worked better than anyone, except perhaps Rodriguez expected. The mining laser's vibrations weakened the flagship's crystalline structure, while the improvised coffee maker bomb, launched through their mineral processing tube, disrupted their neural networks. In the chaos that followed, Wade's crew got creative. They used the ore separator to scatter sensor-confusing debris. The emergency hull sealant, sprayed into space, froze into razor-sharp crystals that shredded Vorax fighter craft. Even the ship's old atmosphere scrubbers found a new life as makeshift propulsion units. When it was over, The mighty Vorax fleet had been defeated by what their after-action report would describe as incomprehensible violations of established combat protocols. The Galactic news networks couldn't make sense of it. How had a mining ship with no military capabilities disabled a Vorax dreadnought? The concept of improvisation had to be explained 7 different ways before alien species even began to grasp it. In her report to Earth Command, Wade kept it simple. Used what we had. Made it work. She didn't mention the 3 pages of safety regulations they'd creatively reinterpreted, or the fact that Rodriguez had violated about 50 laws of physics by convincing the coffee maker it could be an EMP generator. The Galactic Council's emergency session following the incident lasted 3 days. The idea that humans could turn anything into a weapon wasn't new, but the realization that they could do it while cracking jokes and violating the laws of physics sent shockwaves through the galaxy. A new warning was added to all galactic shipping lanes. Caution, human space, expect the impossible, and whatever you do, don't threaten their mining ships. Especially if they have coffee makers. Ryan Cooper adjusted his bolo tie and surveyed the Grand Hall of Galactic Unity, where species that had hated each other for millennia sat in carefully calculated neutral zones. The Tennessee diplomat had spent weeks studying the complex web of ancient feuds and alliances that defined galactic politics. His conclusion: they all needed a good barbecue. Distinguished representatives, the High Mediator's crystalline form pulsed with diplomatic frequencies. We have gathered to address the human question. Question. Cooper interrupted, his drawl cutting through the formal atmosphere. Seems to me the only question is why you all haven't tried my mama's secret recipe barbecue sauce yet. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. The Xylaxians and quantum collectives exchanged horrified glances. No one interrupted the High Mediator. It simply wasn't done. Ambassador Cooper, the mediator's tone carried carefully modulated disapproval. This is hardly the time for discussions of primitive protein consumption rituals. Cooper grinned, pulling out a thermal container. See, that's where you're wrong. Back home, we've got this saying. The way to the heart is through the stomach. Though I reckon for some of y'all, it might be through whatever organ processes nutrients. Before anyone could stop him, he'd set up a small serving station. The aroma of carefully modified barbecue, adjusted for each species' biological requirements, began wafting through the chamber's air filtration system. Now take the Hive Collective and the Silicon Consciousness, Cooper continued, serving specially prepared portions. Been fighting over the Crimson Nebula for what? 12,000 years. But did anyone ever ask why both species wanted? The representatives shifted uncomfortably. The question violated every principle of diplomatic protocol. You didn't ask about motivations. You simply processed the stated positions through approved diplomatic algorithms. Ambassador, the High Mediator attempted to regain control. The established protocols. Protocols ain't worth much if they don't solve problems, Cooper drawled, passing out more plates. Now, Silicon Consciousness needs the nebula's radiation for energy. Hive Collective needs the magnetic fields for navigation. Seems to me there's room for both, especially if you add some research stations to study how the two interact. Could benefit everyone. The chamber fell silent as ancient enemies found themselves considering possibilities their diplomatic computers had never calculated. The Silicon Consciousness representative's crystalline surface flickered with unexpected patterns. This flavor combination, it creates unexpected synergies, they observed, sampling Cooper's specially prepared silicon-based barbecue. Kind of like your two species could, Cooper suggested. Sometimes the best combinations are the ones nobody thought to try. Over the next several hours, Cooper committed diplomatic heresy after heresy. He got the quantum collectives and plasma entities to recognize their mutual interest in energy research. He convinced the Crystalline Confederation and the gas giant Consciousness that their centuries-old territorial dispute was actually an opportunity for atmospheric mining cooperation. And he did it all over plates of barbecue, swapping stories, and what he called just plain folks talking to folks. The High Mediator watched in horror as thousands of years of careful diplomatic procedure crumbled in the face of what Cooper called good old boy diplomacy. Species were forming alliances based on shared interests rather than calculated advantages. They were relating to each other. This is unprecedented. The mediator's harmonics vibrated with distress. There are no protocols for this type of interaction. Cooper leaned back, wiping barbecue sauce from his chin. Maybe that's the problem. Y'all got so caught up in protocols, you forgot that sometimes folks just need to sit down together and find common ground, or common space, as the case may be. Later, as the chamber buzzed with unprecedented informal discussions between ancient enemies, Cooper sent a message back to Earth. Mission proceeding as planned. They're starting to understand that diplomacy doesn't have to be logical to work. Still haven't told them about office politics, figure that might blow their minds completely. The Galactic Council's diplomatic algorithms crashed trying to calculate the implications. Humans hadn't just violated diplomatic protocols, they'd made protocols irrelevant. And somewhere in the galaxy, a Tennessee diplomat was teaching ancient species that sometimes the best negotiating strategy was simply being neighborly. A new term entered the galactic diplomatic lexicon: human-style negotiations. It was both a warning and a recognition that perhaps the old ways weren't always the best ways. The Galactic Council's Department of Cultural Containment was having a very bad day. Agent Zix 895 stared at the holographic report with mounting horror. Die Hard had somehow leaked onto the Galactic Entertainment Networks. How bad is it? Asked Superior Monitor Vex 335, their crystalline form clouded with concern. Catastrophic, Zix 895 replied. The hive mind youth collectives are already quoting something called yippee-ki-yay. The silicon consciousness has begun experimenting with what they term crawling through maintenance ducts, and the quantum entities, they're attempting to understand the concept of winging it. But that was just the beginning. In a classroom on New Houston Colony, Laura Barnes was about to accidentally trigger a cultural revolution. The Texas high school history teacher had been invited to give a guest lecture on human history to a mixed class of alien diplomatic offspring. So there they were. Laura gestured enthusiastically, her voice carrying through the quantum-linked classroom to thousands of alien students across the galaxy. Just a bunch of colonists with farming tools facing the mighty British Empire. And you know what they did. They got creative. A crystalline youth surface rippled with confusion, but their probability of success was virtually zero. Laura grinned. That's the thing about humans. We're really bad at accepting other people's math about what's possible. Those colonists invented guerrilla warfare, used unconventional tactics, and basically rewrote the rules of engagement. They changed the rules. A young quantum entity struggled with the concept, without submitting the proper documentation. Sometimes, Laura explained, pulling up images of the American Revolution, the biggest changes start with someone asking why not, instead of accepting, because that's how it's always been done. The lecture was meant to be a simple cultural exchange. Instead, it went viral across the galactic networks. Young aliens began questioning traditional hierarchies. The hive mind youth started exploring individual thought. Silicon consciousness adolescents experimented with intuitive problem-solving rather than pure logic. In a high-level emergency session, the council watched in dismay as reports flooded in. A group of young crystallines had formed a debate club where they deliberately argued against logical conclusions. The Quantum Entity Educational Collective reported students attempting to improvise during standardized probability calculations. Most disturbing of all, a popular entertainment channel had begun broadcasting Earth classic movies with titles like Independence Day, Hidden Figures, and Dead Poets Society. The impact was immediate and widespread. It's not just entertainment anymore, Zix 895 reported grimly. They're absorbing human concepts of revolution, innovation, and individual thinking. The Vorax youth are staging what they call protest against traditional battle algorithms. In her classroom, unaware of the chaos she'd helped spawn, Laura continued her lessons. Today's topic: the Renaissance and the power of questioning established knowledge. You see, she explained to her increasingly enthusiastic students, sometimes the most important discoveries come from asking what if, instead of accepting what is. A young hive mind student raised their consciousness matrix. Is that why humans progress so quickly? Because you question everything. Partly. Laura smiled. We also have this thing called imagination. The ability to envision things that don't exist yet, and then figure out how to make them real. That concept spread through galactic youth culture like wildfire. The Council watched helplessly as young aliens began exhibiting terrifying human traits: creativity, skepticism, individual initiative. In the Galactic archives, an urgent report was filed. Human cultural contamination has reached critical levels. Their entertainment doesn't just tell stories. It changes how people think. Most concerning development. Alien youth are beginning to use the phrase, "why not?" in academic discourse. Laura's original lecture had been viewed over 1 billion times, spawning what alarmed cultural analysts termed a cascade of unauthorized innovation. Young aliens were forming mixed-species social groups, sharing human entertainment, and worst of all, starting to improvise. The Council's final warning came too late. Human culture isn't just entertainment. It's a cognitive virus that transforms minds through stories. Most dangerous of all, it makes this transformation seem not just possible, but inevitable. And somewhere in a Texas classroom, a history teacher smiled as her students learned the most dangerous human lesson of all. The future belongs to those who dare to imagine it differently. Governor Billy Hayes stood in New Dakota's main square, his worn cowboy boots planted firmly on soil that had taken 5 years to make farmable. Above him, through the colony's atmospheric shields, he could see it, the harvester swarm, a cloud of biomechanical monsters that had devoured civilizations for millions of years. How long? He asked, not taking his eyes off the approaching threat. Dr. Emily Martinez, the colony's chief scientist, checked her tablet. 6 days until they reach our orbit. The Galactic Council's evacuation ships will arrive in 3. Billy adjusted his Stetson, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well now, who said anything about evacuating? The Council's message had been clear. No colony had ever survived the harvester swarm. The massive biological-mechanical hybrid entities followed precise mathematical patterns, stripping planets of resources with perfect efficiency. Their movements were as predictable as they were unstoppable. But they'd never met New Dakota's farmers. "Get me the colony broadcast," Billy commanded. Minutes later, he addressed all 10,000 colonists. "Folks, we've got ourselves what my granddaddy would call an interesting situation. Now, conventional wisdom says we should run. But here's the thing about farmers. We don't abandon our land." In the colony's engineering bay, Chief Engineer Joe Wilson was already tinkering with the agricultural terraforming equipment. "If they're biological," he muttered, "then they can get sick." Dr. Martinez caught on immediately. "And if they're mechanical, they can break down," Joe finished, grinning as he reprogrammed a crop duster. The next 6 days saw New Dakota transform. Irrigation systems became chemical weapons delivery platforms. Grain silos were converted into electromagnetic pulse generators. The colony's children, raised on stories of Earth's clever resistance fighters, suggested using the massive threshing machines as mobile weapons platforms. "It's insane," the Council's emergency observer declared. "You cannot defeat the swarm with farming equipment." Billy just smiled, the same way his ancestors had smiled when told you couldn't farm the Texas Dust Bowl. "Watch us." The colony's defensive strategy defied every military principle in the galaxy. They used weather control systems meant for crop management to create targeted storm systems. Fertilizer became explosive compounds. The colony's prized herd of genetically modified cattle, engineered for the harsh environment, were equipped with experimental electromagnetic disruption devices. The beauty of it, Billy explained to the increasingly bewildered council observer, is that they're perfectly predictable. And that makes them perfectly vulnerable. When the swarm arrived, they encountered something no calculation could have predicted. The atmospheric storms, seeded with tailored biochemical agents developed from local bacteria, played havoc with their biological components. Electromagnetic pulses from repurposed grain silos disrupted their mechanical systems. But the real surprise came from the colony's teenagers. Young Sarah Chen, winner of last year's science fair, had figured out how to use the colony's massive network of underground irrigation pipes to create resonance frequencies that the swarm's hive mind couldn't process. "It's like line dancing," she explained to the dumbfounded council observer. "You've got to know when to stop and when to swing." The battle for New Dakota lasted exactly 18 hours. When it was over, the harvester swarm, terror of the galaxy for millions of years, had been reduced to confused, disconnected units that were easily picked off by farmers driving modified combine harvesters. Billy's report to Earth Command was characteristically understated. "Solve the bug problem. Might have a good fertilizer solution for next season's crops too." The Galactic Council's analysis team spent months trying to understand how a farming colony had achieved what mighty civilizations couldn't. They studied the modified equipment, the improvised weapons, the innovative tactics, but they missed the key factor, the human ability to look at a problem and see possibilities instead of limitations. In the aftermath, as news spread across the galaxy, a new saying emerged among alien species: "If you want to build an unstoppable force, don't let humans know it's supposed to be unstoppable." And on New Dakota, where the defeated swarm's biomechanical remnants were being studied for agricultural applications, Governor Hayes added a new sign at the colony's entrance: "Home of the galaxy's best pest control service. No bug too big." Professor Tom Anderson stood before the Galactic Council, his weathered tweed jacket and worn leather elbow patches a stark contrast to the gleaming crystalline chamber. The Boston University professor had been summoned to explain humanity's impact on galactic civilization, and perhaps to help chart a course forward. "Distinguished council members," he began, running a hand through his silver hair, "you invited me here to explain why humans are dangerous. But I'd like to suggest we're asking the wrong question. The real question is, why does the galaxy need us?" The chamber erupted in murmurs. High Counselor Vex Prime's crystalline form pulsed with concern. "Need you? Your species has disrupted every system we've established. Your Captain Reynolds destroyed our economic models. Your lawyer O'Connor shattered our legal frameworks. Your Governor Hayes proved our military calculations meaningless." "Exactly," Anderson smiled, pacing the chamber floor. "And in each case, what happened after the disruption? Did the galaxy collapse, or did it evolve?" He gestured to the massive data displays surrounding them. "Your economists now understand that not every transaction can be predicted, and that's led to more robust markets. Your legal systems have learned to adapt to new situations instead of being bound by ancient precedents. Your military strategists have discovered that the best defense isn't perfect prediction, but perfect adaptability." A young quantum entity representative spoke up. "But the chaos, the uncertainty, is the very thing that drives evolution." Anderson finished. "Look at your own histories. Every species here reached a point where they became perfect at what they did, and then they stopped growing." He pulled up images from Earth's history, displaying them across the chamber's holographic screens. "This is what humans call the Renaissance, a period when questioning everything led to our greatest advances. This is the Industrial Revolution, when we turned impossibilities into daily realities. This is the Digital Age, when we made the intangible tangible." The council watched in fascination as humanity's chaotic but brilliant history played out before them. "But the cultural contamination," began another representative. "You mean the way your young are learning to question, to imagine, to create?" Anderson's eyes twinkled. Let me tell you about a concept we call jazz. It's a form of music where the whole point is to improvise, to take established patterns and transform them into something new. That's what humanity brings to the galaxy, the ability to jazz. He approached the High Counselor's podium. You fear us because we're unpredictable, because we don't follow established patterns, because we look at the impossible and say challenge accepted. But those aren't bugs in our system, they're features. The chamber fell silent as Anderson reached his conclusion. You've been calling us probability nullifiers, like it's a danger warning. I suggest we're something else. We're pattern breakers. And sometimes, breaking old patterns is the only way to create new possibilities. An ancient crystalline elder, their surface showing the accumulated wisdom of millennia, spoke up. And what of order? Of stability. Did you know? Anderson replied, that Earth scientists once thought that stability was the natural state of the universe. Then we discovered that change, adaptation, and even chaos are fundamental to existence. The galaxy doesn't need more stability. It needs the courage to dance with uncertainty. In the hours that followed, the Council debated humanity's role in galactic society. But something had changed. They weren't discussing how to contain humanity anymore. They were exploring how to integrate human unpredictability into galactic civilization. The final resolution created a new classification. Humanity, designated innovators. Their role would be to challenge assumptions, find new solutions, and yes, occasionally break things that needed breaking. As Anderson left the chamber, a young alien student approached him. Professor, does this mean the galaxy will become chaotic like Earth? Anderson laughed. No, it means the galaxy will learn to dance. Sometimes you follow the steps, sometimes you improvise, but you always keep moving forward. That's the human factor. We're not here to destroy the dance, we're here to add new moves. And so the galaxy's greatest fear became its greatest asset. Humanity's gift wasn't destruction or chaos. It was the courage to imagine something new, the creativity to make it real, and the audacity to think that maybe, just maybe, the impossible was worth trying. In the years that followed, a new saying spread through the galaxy. When faced with an impossible problem, ask a human. They haven't heard it's impossible yet.